Welcome to Wild and Exposed, your number one adventure, nature, and outdoor photography podcast. Wild and Exposed is hosted by Mike Mauro, Ron Hayes, and Jason Loftus. Thanks for tuning in.
All right, we've got Drew Hamilton, Homer, Alaska resident, not native. And I think you'll find out, though, in the coming conversation that Drew is all over the globe and doing some really exciting stuff with photography, guiding, being out, just being able to take in some of these giant wildlife happenings that occur throughout North America. Welcome, Drew. Appreciate you taking the time to come on the podcast.
Great to be here. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
That's awesome. Where are you at right now?
So I'm just coming back. I'm making my way back to, it's my northern migration here. I was down in the mountains of Mexico for close to a month doing tours to see the monarch butterfly congregation down there. And so you got all the monarch butterflies from east of the Rocky Mountains migrate to this one little spot in Mexico. So go down there and hang out. That's where I get my vitamin D for the winter. And now I'm at my mom's house in Washington, where I've got up in Bellingham on Friday. I've got a photo opening at a museum up there about polar bears. So shifting gears from microfauna to megafauna. And then eventually I'll make it back to Homer, where I can start shoveling snow.
Yes, indeed.
Have you heard a lot? Is there a lot of snow up there this year?
Well, there wasn't a ton of snow right up until I left. And I think a couple days after that, because I actually live up on the hill about 1,200 feet up above Homer. So all the rain that falls in Homer falls as snow at my place. So a couple days after I left, they got like 3 feet or something like that. And I think I got to go get my truck out.
It's always an adventure. It's an expedition, right? So when does that put you back in Homer then? Probably a couple weeks?
Well, so no, I think I fly back on Saturday. So coming up this weekend and getting back just in time for the start of the Iditarod, which is always a fun time. They've had the Fur Ronde going on there in Anchorage. I think I've missed the beard competition this year, but it's always the same guy that wins. It's all politics. It's who you know. It's in the beard competitions. But the start of the Iditarod is probably the event that most Alaskans in South Central look forward to every year. It's the first excuse to kind of get out. Hopefully it'll be a nice day, go out, see the dogs, and it's just a fun time.
I've never got to do that, but I'd really like to do that at some point.
Yeah, I'd like to see the start and the finish, but I think Nome is a pretty hard place to get to around the finish.
Yeah, because it fills up, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's you might be able to find a few square feet of floor to crash on if you know the right people. But other than that, you got to plan it a year, maybe a year and a half in advance. Then a couple of years, they had one of the hotels burned down. So that puts the pinch on hotel space.
Yeah, for sure.
But it's great. Like Nome, I'm always a big advocate for people going to Nome, particularly birders. They got the Siberian blue throats that go there. And then, that's the best place to access muskox. Yeah, you can find it right outside town there. And
snowies too, right? Snowy owls.
I've never caught any there, but I've never. True confession, I'm not much of a birder.
Yeah, me either. But I've always heard that it's a good place in the spring, early summer, and you can find some nesting snowies up there.
That would make perfect sense. Like you look at the environment, like it seems like it would be perfect for them, but I have trouble making it past the muskox.
Right.
Yeah, for sure. So Drew, give us a little bit of background on just exactly who you are. How'd you get to the point where you were photographing wildlife? Is that something that you grew up doing?
Well, so I grew up in Iowa, of all places, right in the middle of Iowa. And my parents owned a small town newspaper. And so when I was a kid, keep me out of trouble, I had free run of the darkroom, and so I could go in. I couldn't touch the new stacks of photo paper, but anything that had already been cut, I could have at it. So I made a lot of like L-shaped collages and things like that. And then eventually, my mom, who was one of the photographers at the newspaper, gave me her old AE1, and I could go in. I could roll my own film. I could just have at it basically. And then, took photography in high school. And then I was out on the East Coast. I was going into international relations at American University, and I was sitting in a microeconomics class in a basement classroom with flickering fluorescent lights and peeling paint. I'm conjuring it right now. I can picture it. And I said, if I keep doing this, I'm going to end up in rooms just like this one for the rest of my life. So turns out Alaska is about as far away from Washington, D.C. as you can get. So I hopped in a 1988 Jeep Wrangler, picked up a buddy in Iowa, drove to Alaska, and was driving down. I put my last $17 in gas in my gas tank and drove down the Kenai Peninsula looking for work, and ran out of gas in front of a fishing lodge. And we coasted in there and said, hey, you need any work? And turns out they did, because it's summertime in Alaska and everybody needs help. And they had a bear viewing camp. And so they flew me. This was in 1999. 99. That was just yesterday, right? And so flew out to Chinitna Bay on Lake Clark National Park. And that was back when a big day in a big summer in Chinitna Bay, we'd get 300, 400 people over the whole summer. You go there now, it's quite different. But so went out there, and there was an old homesteader that lived out there, and met him. And that was the guy that I kind of learned the most about how to move, how to live around bears. The most bears I ever saw in his backyard, which is, of course, now Lake Clark National Park, was 52. You got this big sedge meadow back there, and you got 50 bears spread out like bison, basically. That was the comment we get in the springtime, particularly when they're grazing. It's, oh, they look like a herd of bison, and they kind of do. So from there, I got a lot of on-the-ground experience with bears. We'd run around, you'd have guests come in, and they've got an electric fence around the tent, and they thought the electric fence was to keep the bears out. But from the staff's perspective, it was to keep the guests in. So you turn on the electric fence, then you got free run of the whole park. Because everybody's scared to death of the electric fence. And that's when you'd go have your good times and learn a lot about bears. And that's where you make your mistakes, you figure stuff out. And so from there, I got hired on by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to work at McNeil River, which is the largest congregation of brown bears anywhere on Earth. It takes a special permit. You got to win a permit in a lottery just to set foot in there. They take 10 people a day. You camp out for 4 days. So I was out there for 6 years, and that was really where I launched back into photography, because one of the projects they have is a photo ID project, being able to identify these bears through space and time. And so every day that we went out there, it was my job to photograph bears for 10, 12 hours a day. And
tough
sometimes,
job.
Right. And it was a state job. So, you're in a union, you got healthcare, you got all this vacation time, that's the best job in bear viewing right there, is working at McNeil River. And, so from there, you're sitting there for 10 hours a day trying to figure out how to, once you've documented the bears from all their angles and whatnot, claws, scars, colors, things like that. Well, then you're sitting there thinking, well, what if I slowed that shutter speed down? Or what if I tried this angle? And then it kind of branches out from just not boredom, but just looking for something new for after all that. And then from there, I started on one of our fish technicians would come out and he'd say, hey, you want to see some polar bears? You got to meet my wife, Annie. So she got me hooked up with Natural Habitat Adventures, and I started going to Churchill. And then from there, I met people in Churchill who said, wow, he's got a lot of on-the-ground experience with bears. Would you like to branch out into on-the-ground stuff with polar bears? I said, sure. So a lot of it's just kind of saying yes.
Mm-hmm.
And being in the right place at the right time, right?
Right place in the right time. When you get to places like Churchill and people just start, the opportunities that pop up just from being in some place like Homer or being in some place like Churchill, it's pretty mind-blowing, some of the stuff that people will ask you to do.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a pretty awesome, that's a great story. That's a good Alaska story too, right? I mean, going up there with no money, running out of gas, ending up right there. What's the guy's name that was the first ranger at McNeil? Is it Larry Allmiller?
Larry Allmiller, yeah.
Did you read his, well, I'm sure you've read his book, the one, I just picked it up last year in Seward.
In Wild Trust.
And he has a similar story, because didn't he just cruise up there in a Jeep? Kind of same sort of thing, where he just ended up there, and then it just kind of evolved from that. And he's the one who designed the pad and all this kind of interaction with bears and how to do it and how to. I mean, it's an awesome. If you haven't read that book, it's well worth the read.
That's how we do it in Alaska. You just you got a lot of smart people who are there because they love it, and you got stuff you got to get done. And so everybody you call on I mean, Larry was an art major. He was in the Army. He was an art major. He drew pictures of generals and stuff. And somehow that translated into being the greatest bear viewing guide of all time. Right. I mean, he was out at McNeil for 32. He still goes. He's retired now, but I think he's going on 35, 36 seasons out at McNeil River. And you think about, for those who don't know, and McNeil River doesn't get a lot of advertising. It's a program put on by Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and they're not they're not really into marketing. But I mean, it is, if you want to learn about bear behavior and you want to learn about it fast, that's the place to do it. Because I mean, you'll be sitting there. The most bears I ever saw at McNeil Falls at one time was 78. So you're sitting there. There are no fences. This is the program that Larry set up. You know, you're sitting there. You got 78 bears around you. There are no fences. You're just kind of casual. And you describe it to people, and they're like, "Oh, you're nuts." But when you're there, it makes perfect sense.
Right.
You know, it's hard to describe. And then there's just something powerful about having that much and fitting so naturally into the environment. I would put McNeil River up there with any high level ethical wildlife viewing operation in the world. Like, it is, in a lot of ways, it's the most protected parcel of non-military land in the state of Alaska, just because it is so, the human behavior is so tightly regulated. And I mean, you see all these behaviors, but you see them stacked on top of one another. And, you know, over the course of the day, I think the most bears we saw in a day was somewhere north of 100. And yeah, it's a crash course in bear behavior for sure.
You said something earlier when you were going through your history, when you first met that old timer in Lake Clark, and you said something about learning what not to do. You know, after you turn on the electric fence and everybody's behind the fence, and then you're out there. I mean, it's not like you're out there running away from bears. You're just learning how to interact with these bears, and maybe you can describe some of that. I try to explain this all the time to people where, you know, you show them a picture and you're, I don't know, 20, 30 yards away from a grizzly bear or a brown bear, and everybody's like, "Oh my God." And you know, it's just so hard to convey that it's no danger. There's this symbiotic relationship that it's what's the word? It's just
hard to describe.
It's hard to describe.
It is. Especially when you're talking to people that photograph in Yellowstone and the lower 48, being around those bears is a little bit different.
Yeah, it's definitely a do not try this at home scenario. And really, it comes back to when you watch bears interact with each other and you realize that they're excellent communicators. They will tell you exactly what is on their mind. And there's nothing ambiguous about it. Like, they are upfront. And it's being able to decipher in an effective way because they only speak bear. So they have, you know, maybe 5 words, and so much of it is contextual. And being able to identify situations that you either need to be careful with or just remove yourself from. Like, if 2 bears are about to get in a fight, you don't want to be anywhere near that. You're going to start giving them a little more space. It's about reading bear behavior and giving them what they want, whether it's space, whether it's, it sounds, unless you have experience doing this, it sounds kind of weird, but sometimes they are looking for proximity. It's a behavior called refuging. You frequently see it with moms and cubs. Like, we've had mother bears will stash their cubs at our feet while they go fish. And it's because the human behavior to them is more predictable. So they know we're not going to mess with their cubs, but they also know that no other bear is going to come through us. We're basically a human shield to them. And it's a relationship that's built over time. You wouldn't let that situation happen with a bear that you are just meeting for the first time, say. That's something that you get with experience. And like you've for example, because they know individual humans. And the perfect example is out at McNeil River, where I was there for 6 years. And my boss, Tom Griffin, who's another legendary bear viewing guide, had been there for 20 years at that point. He worked with Larry, and then I was the new guy at that point. And there was this older, dominant female that called Waterfalls, and she was in the Disney Bears movie. She's turned up in a lot of publications. And with Tom, like I'd go out with Tom, but if Tom was there, she would roll right in front of you, pull your feet in, here she comes, she's just going straight line through. But if it was me, or if Tom wasn't there, she would still do similar behaviors, but she would just do it a little further away, kind of thing. So she's like, oh, checking us out. Oh, Tom's not there. I'll just take a little bit wider route. And it's not that we were interfering. I mean, she was still going right by. It's just a matter of her comfort level with the makeup of the people that were there. And if you've seen it once, you've seen it 1,000 times. You could have a highly habituated bear that's going to walk by you. And that's when Murphy's Law dictates that somebody sneezes, or somebody hits the zipper on their jacket, and that bear's like, oh wait, no, I'll just go a little bit further away. So it really is more about managing people, and you want them to be able to behave in that specific way that is going to be non-impactful to the bears at all. You want them to be as natural as possible, and that's where you get the best photographs. Is you'll get the very natural. You can still get the eyes, but they're not necessarily looking at you. They're completely immersed in, they're focused on the fish. They're not looking at the people. They're looking at the fish. And that's the natural moment that I like my guests to be able to capture, rather than having the bear just, staring you down or because when the bear's looking at you, that means there's a photographer in the area. Mm-hmm. But I strive to capture those moments where it's just more natural, like you're not even there, really.
I think that the people management comment is probably the biggest issue that a guide would have to deal with, but it's also the biggest issue that, for instance, the Park Service has to deal with. A lot of the policies that are coming down in parks in the lower 48 they're not necessarily due to what is stated. We want to save the alpine flora, but really it's, hey, let's keep people in one area so we don't just destroy the whole mountain. And so the people management thing goes with the wildlife. It goes with just park policies, areas in the park, keeping people away from cliffs where they're going to try to take the ultimate selfie and end up falling off the back. I mean, you hear that more and more these days. We've got to get this selfie. So people management is probably the biggest thing that they deal with. And as a guide, I would imagine that, it's probably a lot easier to learn bear behavior than it is to predict how your customers are going to behave themselves.
Well, and then it's also a new twist. It was real nice being out at McNeil River because you're the only folks for 200 square miles because you got the permit to go in there. But when you go out and you get people who are going to Katmai on their own, or just not as up on, and not just bear behavior, but those specific bears, because every bear is different. And so, like, for example, I was doing a trip for Natural Habitat, and they've got a boat that cruises up and down the Katmai coast, and we were in this bay. It was just north of Geographic. So we were one bay up, and we're sitting there, and this mom and two cubs, two spring cubs, so the little ones, super cute, super tolerant. We're sitting there watching her, and some other photographers moved in, and she went upstream. And so the other group was like, all right, we're going to charge up there. And they went following her and, going up. And if you'd been there and been paying attention to the dynamic in the area, you realize that, 2 bends up is where that big male's been hanging out. And I said, well, we're just going to sit here because she's going to be back in 15 minutes because she's going to run into that guy and bounce right back to us. And then sure enough, the group followed her up. 15 minutes, here she comes wandering back, and we're already in position to get the shot of her with her cubs fishing in this pool. So like it's all about understanding the bears in the area, understanding the behavior, and then preaching the mantra of patience. And so by hard charging and following her up there, they didn't get anything. Whereas if you just sit in one spot, if that's the worst thing that happens is you get to sit along the side of a river for an extra hour, like, hey, you're doing all right. But it's putting all these things together and then already being in position when she gets in. So it's always harder. You can't get into position. If she's already there, you can't get in there without upsetting something, right? Your space bubble is going to bump into hers. There's going to be an unnatural interaction for a period. But if you're already sitting there and she can just roll in and say, yep, okay, that's true, they're cool, then she just rolls in natural as can be, and no big deal.
I think that's something that needs to be, I don't think you can talk about it enough. The patience aspect of what we do. And I know everybody that is out there photographing wants that shot, right? And you're striving so hard to get that one shot that you're proud of, or that you can put on a wall, or that you can show somebody. And if you're patient, it'll oftentimes, I find, so I shoot a ton of video and I can't run around. It's hard to chase. In fact, I don't ever, I'll look at a situation, depending on whatever the species is, and you try to set up and predict, oh, this might happen if everything is left alone and this animal's let to be doing whatever it's doing. My guess is this is what's going to happen. And 9 times out of 10, it happens. And you're speaking to that exactly. And with you having that knowledge of a bigger bear, then that situation. And it's hard because you got all these photographers that are sitting with you saying, come on, Drew, what are you doing? But in reality, you're teaching that lesson that is so important for everybody to learn. Just have a little patience. And if you just give them their space, you're probably going to get that shot. Plus, get way more shots because you'll have that animal being in a natural state, doing whatever it's doing that you're trying to get an image of.
And you can also compose your backdrop. Like you've got that time to set up and be emotionally prepared for what you hope is going to happen. Good photos aren't taken; they're made. Mm-hmm. Like if you do your due diligence and you put in your patience and craft that image before the subject is there. You're just waiting for the talent, basically. You're the production crew, and then the talent rolls in, and boom, you're all set up. Just that easy. And really, the best, that you're talking about the preserve. That I had 2 guys on a camping trip out there this year. We were out there with Graham Purdy and Dave Sanford, 2 amazing photographers, hard working. Like you get out in the field with these guys and they put you through your paces. And we'd go out there and we basically sat in the exact same spot for a week. Like we went in, and I had done some advanced scouting, and I came in that first day and I said, okay, guys, here's what I think. And they picked which of those ideas they liked. And frankly, you don't leave until you get that. Yeah, we were in basically one spot for a week. We did hide under some alders once to get out of the sun because it was so hot in Alaska last summer.
It's crazy, right? I try to tell people that all the time now. We were out at Katmai one year and it was 100 degrees and there were no alders, and we were setting up our tripods and putting our coats over our tripods and trying to lay in that shade. But no, and I think you chose that. You gave them the option. You guys are creating that shot. You're making that shot, and that is so important. I think people would be so much more happy getting that kind of a shot than having the butt of an animal walking away, or an animal that is startled, or an animal that just really doesn't know, hey, there's 10 people here and I just don't know. I think I'm just going to go this way, and nobody gets a shot at that point.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of it's karma too. I'm a firm believer in karma. Like, the more respectful you are, the more efforts you make to not necessarily blend into your environment, but to match your energy to the environment that's around. The wildlife responds well to that, just because those are the things that they're sensitive to, and it pays dividends in the end. Mm-hmm. And long lenses help too.
Talking about long lenses, and we always like to talk with everybody we talk to, we like to highlight some of their equipment. Not that it matters, but what are you using these days, and what do you feel like is the best kit for going out and doing this bear stuff?
Well, so I fully recognize that my needs as a guide are completely different, because when I'm carrying my kit, I also have to have bear deterrence. I also have to have first aid kit. I also have to have emergency clothing. I also have that, and that adds up fast. And so I switched over to a micro 4/3 system 4 or 5 years ago. I saw folks doing it, like Eric Rock and Justin Gibson and folks like that I was working with at the time. And I'm lugging my stuff, and they've just got this little setup. So I've gone through a few different versions over the years. And when I go out on any given day, I only bring one lens, and whatever lens I have, I need to make that work. And so my go-to setup right now is the Olympus EM1X with their 300 millimeter f4. So it's a 2x crop. So that's getting you out at 600 millimeters. And I've kind of learned that when a bear fills a frame at 600 millimeters, I should be working. That's time for me anyway, to put the camera down. And it is limiting, but I've really enjoyed shooting with kind of that semi-fast prime, because it does force you to be creative with shots. And I know Ron and I had some discussions about stitching photos in the past, and my love of stitching photos kind of comes from my only zoom is my feet. And if you can't move your feet, you need to stitch them. And so when I sat down and said, okay, here are the things I need portability. Like right now, my 2 bodies and my entire lens kit from 14 millimeters 2.8 all the way up to, I can go up to 1200 millimeters handheld with their stabilization system, but it all fits in the overhead compartment on a 737. Like that for me, when you make a list of everything you actually need, for me, the Olympus system is what shook out. When I go do Aurora trips, because I've led a bunch of Aurora trips over the years, I did get a Sony A7S II, just because I wanted to do video of the Aurora.
That's what I was going to ask. Are you doing any video?
I do. Ironically, a lot of my income comes from viral video, but I don't shoot that much video. I have the ability to, but I don't really have an outlet for it, I don't feel. Because the conservation work I've been, now about half my time is devoted to volunteer conservation work. And I think managing viral videos and things like that takes time that I just don't have right now.
Well, that's a fun system to have, and using that Sony with the Aurora, is that the best camera out there at the moment for that sort of thing? I don't know anything about it.
It's the S2, which they've been teasing the S3 for too long now, frankly. Sony, if you're listening, come on.
But it's about the best low light setup you can get, isn't it? Even now. Even
as old as it is, it's still right up there for low light. And at the time, it was kind of revolutionary, because I was doing Aurora trips in Churchill, Manitoba at the time, where you're I think the coldest wind chill we had was like minus 64, and we're out there. And so I did run into some battery life issues that I think the Sony has corrected in the 3s, or maybe they're even on 4s on some of them. So the battery life has gotten a lot better. But I still do like to bust out the Olympus. It's everybody complains about, low light this, low light that. But frankly, the colors on the Olympus that it renders are much more accurate than I can take images right out of the Olympus and the colors are right, and I don't have to mess around with them, because Sony tends to make them a little too neon for my liking anyway. But then I was looking at lenses for it, and what I ended up going with, because you had these entry level, and then you had like the super expensive Zeiss and stuff like that. But then there are these Rokinon Cine lenses. Mm-hmm. And just because it's a Cine lens doesn't mean you can't take photos with it. And so I ended up getting the Rokinon 24 millimeter. I think it's like a T15. And then I also have their 16 or 16 2.8, I think. So I have one Cine lens for the Sony, and then I have one regular, and it's all manual anyway. So
right.
And then I've got my Sony all rigged up that really it's just a couple buttons. Like I don't have any, because battery issues are important. So no lights, no screens. I hit 2 buttons. And I found that, most people with Aurora, they shoot in full manual, or what I do is with the Olympus, I would shoot in aperture priority mode, and I would starting ISO at 1,000, and then put your exposure compensation on +2 full stops. And then I'd put on the intervalometer, because I'm helping people with cameras and stuff. I'm not there to take pictures. I'm there to help people take pictures. So I would just set mine up and put on the intervalometer. So it would just take pictures, and my camera's sitting over on the side, and I'm running around helping people, and then it's taking pictures on its own. But with the Sony, and I've noticed this on both the Sony and the D850s, that when people would come in, you tend to think, oh, I'll just crank up the ISO because I can. But what would happen is your ISO gets high enough that it's almost too sensitive, and the camera starts picking up stuff that your eye doesn't see, and it'll turn like a distinct arc into a blur because it's picking up all this diffuse stuff. So you actually have to back it off on your ISO a little bit. If you've got a camera that can do that, like the D850s or the high-end Sonys and things like that, back it off a little bit because it'll wreck your shots. I love filming Aurora. I haven't been able to do enough of that lately, but once you get used to the cold, then you can do it. I run warm anyway, so.
Yeah, when we were photographing the eagles last spring on the Kenai, we had some Aurora. Never made it far enough south to where we were at, but when we went back to Anchorage, it was there, and then all of a sudden the clouds moved in. It was supposed to be this beautiful night. We were going to get up as high as we could and try to get some shots, and then the clouds moved in, and that was that.
That's why Aurora is so tricky. You're looking at the places that are under the oval, and you're looking at like Tromsø, Norway. You're looking at Iceland. You're looking at Churchill. You're looking at Yellowknife. Well, people in Fairbanks will tell you it's Fairbanks, but it's actually just north of Fairbanks. So then you cross-reference that with your, clear skies, and where you've got open water, Norway and Iceland and places like that, you got to go for a week or 10 days to make sure you get a clear sky in there. Whereas you can go to some place like Churchill or Yellowknife, and you can do, because they just have clear skies, you can do it in 4 days kind of thing. But then, there are other things you got to figure, like foreground. Do you want a fjord? There are no fjords in Churchill. There are no fjords in Fairbanks. You got to go to Norway for that. You got to go to Iceland if you want the waterfalls and things like that. Right. So it's make a list. Making a list on your photographic expeditions and saying, well, what do I actually want? And like with cameras, I think a lot of people just want to reserve the right to shoot a basketball game at night or something, like these far end of camera capabilities. And when you sit down and think about it, you really don't need all those bells and whistles, because it's really, a professional camera is whatever camera is in the hands of a professional, and they should be able to make that work.
That's very well said. And we've talked about each of us taking some lower end kind of consumer models out and getting images with those cameras, just to demonstrate that, it's not necessarily the camera in your hand that makes the shot, but the knowledge that you've got in your head. And that was very well said. I like the way you said that. Professional camera is the one that's in the hands of the professional.
Well, my iPhone says Pro on it too, so.
The only thing I had to add to that Aurora conversation was, it seemed like whenever I'd photograph Aurora, it would be in Denali, and we would be in like September. And the hardest thing is waking up to check the skies throughout the night, especially since you've been going all day. You've been looking for sheep or caribou, and you're just running on empty already. And then you're trying to wake up like every hour to check to see if it's clear, number one. And then if you got Aurora going on, number two. When I went to Churchill, that was a whole different ballgame. You're going during polar bear season. It gets dark early. I mean, the Aurora can pop out at like 7 o'clock at night. And it's like, this is awesome because you can actually get some cool shots and you're not running your tank to the complete empty. You go out and do your Aurora and you're back in bed by like 9 o'clock or whatever, whatever the situation is. So what you said about coming up with your schedule or what you're after, that is going to dictate where you have to go, because we were using that old plane, that wrecked plane, and
the Miss Piggy.
And we were using those the cemetery out there. We did some out there, so that was kind of cool. It was something different, but you're not getting nature as much as you're just getting objects that were with the Aurora.
Well, and what Churchill's got for foreground elements is, well, those rocks. Well, crashed airplane. I've hiked out. There's a shipwreck, the MV Ithaca out there. That was a fun. We had a birthday party out there one year where we hiked out, and like everything just came together. We'd hiked out there. Somebody brought cupcakes. By the time we got there, the cupcakes were frozen solid. So you're trying to, gnaw on this jerky-like cupcake. But then it was one of those Aurora shows, and with Aurora, people always say, "Oh, the camera catches more than your eye." Right up. And I'll add to that, right up until it can't. Like, there are Aurora shows that I've seen that the camera can't capture, because this night when we were out at the Ithaca, it was almost like you'd stuck your head in a chandelier. You got the shipwreck and you got the sea ice, and everything around you is just ripping and dancing, and you're seeing oranges and mauves and pinks and things like that. And it's to the point where stopped and
just watch.
Enjoy.
Yeah.
Gnawed on my frozen cupcake.
We had that similar experience in Churchill where Missy had never seen Aurora. So, our buddies we were with called, and it's like 7 o'clock, and they're like, "Hey, Aurora's out. Let's go." We all go out there, and it's just kind of small, little wispy stuff. It's cool. It's the Aurora. It's going on. And Missy was all disappointed. She's like, "This is not what I see in pictures." And I'm like, "Well, hang on. I mean, you never know. Go with the flow and see what happens." And then out of nowhere, it just fires up. And it was that situation where just so much going on, and they're whipping through the sky and doing all this stuff. And at that point, she was just totally blown away. In Denali, a lot of times, it's just that so slight, Aurora that is just pretty predominantly green, and you just don't get all those colors. It's still cool to see, but once you've seen the other end of the spectrum, it's mind-blowing.
Well, and then Denali, something that's on my radar. My buddy Justin Gibson and I are trying to set up a trip up to the Sheldon Chalet.
Yep.
Up on Denali.
Yep.
Do an Aurora trip there.
One of my buddies did that. He camped on the Ruth Glacier. Have you heard of Kenan Ward?
Yeah.
From the old days. I think he does a lot of video. I don't hear much from him anymore, but early on, back in the film days, he was going up solo doing Aurora up there, and it was pretty spectacular. But it's that deal where you got to spend 10 days and hope the weather's with you. But he was able to get some stuff. So
as long as you're dressed for it, though, that's the
yeah. If you're prepared for it, you can make it happen.
Yeah.
Actually, while we're on the topic of Churchill, the brown bears is what you kind of cut your teeth on, right? In Alaska, and then you ended up going up and guiding with the polar bears. What was the biggest differences that you saw between the two species and having to kind of step up your game there?
Well, in terms of going up to see the polar bears, it's just I just like to point this out that Homer is at 59 degrees north. Churchill is at 58 degrees north. Mm-hmm. So I actually have to go south to see polar bears. And it just kind of is this mind twist thing. And I do like to point it out to folks in Churchill. They've got this great northern attitude that I love, and I fit in well with it. But I always kind of just stick it out there that, hey, I love coming down here to see your polar bears. But in terms of the differences, on some level, polar bears are a lot more subtle with their communication. Churchill's had that congregation. It's a loose congregation, but, bears congregate on the shores there for decades now. So they have a bit more, I would say, advanced communication system because they're used to interacting with one another. So they have to have a communication system in place. But it is much more subtle. You have to watch them closer to picking up what they're laying down. basically. And with the brown bears, like you're seeing them at their peak, right? You're seeing when you go see brown bears fishing, say in Alaska or out at Katmai Preserve, like they're business oriented at that point. They have a job to do. When you go watch polar bears, they're not. They're bored out of their minds. Like they're waiting for the ice. And so they'll check anything out. They've got a day to fill. They've got a week to fill before that ice comes in. And so they're just trying not to burn too many calories and make it until the sea ice shows up. So they're quieter. It's in terms of the like actual communication, it's almost like brown bears speak Spanish and polar bears speak Portuguese. Like there are some subtle differences in there that you do pick up on. And one of the things, given my experience at McNeil River and being so close to that many bears communicating all at one time, is I've been to Kaktovik. I went and spent a month up in Kaktovik a couple years ago. I don't know, time flies, whenever that was. And, the goal there is to see them on the whale. Because the villagers bring in a whale and then the polar bears clean up the rest. And the villagers got the whale the day after I left. So gotcha. One of the reasons I wanted to see how those bears communicate in congregation. And an intriguing thing up there is then the grizzly bears will roll in. And so you've got, these 1,200-pound male polar bears getting along just fine on this whale carcass, and then you've got a 300-pound barren ground grizzly that rolls in just like a cannonball full of teeth and claws, and you've got these polar bears falling all over themselves to get out of the way. And it really, it just drives home that with the bears and how they interact with one another, it is all about attitude. One of the talks I give is about rank and hierarchy in bears. And just looking at how the biggest bears, you see a big giant bear, and they're all bigger than we are, right? So any bear qualifies as a big bear. But when you see a truly large bear, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's the alpha bear or the most dominant bear in the area, because they're all individual personalities. And so you've got, I think one of the biggest bears I've ever seen at McNeil River, he was a mellow, he didn't like to fight. And as a consequence, he lived nearly 30 years, but he was huge. Whereas some of those scrapper bears, like a smaller bear, might be the alpha just because he's big on attitude. And can you roll in there and bend other bears to your will without getting your butt kicked? Because the thing is, you can go try to push the other bears around, but there's always a bigger bear.
Right. Now, you have a couple of projects going on. First of all, Don Wilson, who's been on the podcast, in a couple different capacities, and you guys did a book together. Tell us a little bit about that project.
Well, so that project kind of stems from the Pebble Mine fight, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a little bit. And Don and I were talking. We met at McNeil River when she came out and kept in touch via social media. And it's so easy to keep in touch with people these days. And I'd always admired her work in the lower 48. And she's the queen of elk. She just does some amazing stuff down there. And she comes to Alaska quite frequently and does stuff on the Alaska Peninsula, and wanted to get involved with some conservation efforts in a fight specifically against the Pebble Mine. And we were kind of looking at our portfolios and said, hey, between us, we've got a pretty comprehensive look at the Alaska Peninsula. And she's got kind of the North Lake Clark National Park area. She's got McNeil River, and I've got a lot of the Katmai Park and Preserve and McNeil Refuge and some of the other obscure state lands in between. And so we just thought it would be really cool to put together a book that shows, one, all these different bears and highlights how different these bears are, and then highlights the variety of terrain and photographic opportunity that's available on the Alaska Peninsula. Because I think people say, oh, I'm going to Alaska to shoot pictures of brown bears. And you've got a lot of choices. Really, like you could, if you were shopping around for a place that you wanted to go see brown bears in Alaska, you could get this book and flip through and say, oh, I like what they do in the Katmai Preserve, or I like what they do at McNeil River, or I like Katmai, and choose your destination based on the types of images that are coming out. And it's been fun going back through the old portfolio and saying, oh yeah, I remember that day. I'm supposed to be pulling out photos for it, and then you go down the rabbit hole and say, "Oh, remember that? That was fun. Oh, remember that? Oh, that was a good day. That was yeah." and then you come across the pictures that Don and I were out together, and just looking at how you captured the scene differently. It's kind of an intriguing collaborative process. And so proceeds from the book, a portion of every sale does go to a nonprofit I run called Friends of McNeil River, which McNeil River we've mentioned a few times is one of the best places in the world to see brown bears. But it's currently under threat. They want to put there's a mine over on the other side of the mountains called the Pebble Mine, which is, we've been fighting this mine for 20 years, and now it's come to a new phase. It's not permitted yet, but it's currently in the hands of the Army Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency on whether they issue permits for it. But they want to put a road that goes right through the best bear habitat in the world. They want to put a port and a power plant big enough that it would power the city of Anchorage. So it's a significant amount of infrastructure right in the middle of this bear habitat. You know, we can look at case studies from around North America that, one, bears and roads don't mix. And you're also going to have an influx of non-bear savvy miners come into this area. You know, frankly, the things I worry about most are food conditioning. So you've got inexperienced people in wilderness areas where I do my bear viewing and my guests, and you've got inexperienced people providing food, providing access to trap. A habitual bear is not by itself dangerous. A food conditioned bear, a bear that associates people with or as food, is a highly dangerous situation. So one, they're putting my livelihood and my guests and our safety at risk. And then the fact that they're not doing their due diligence on the science involved with this whole project. So, you know, between the mine, between the road, and between the port, technically that should be three huge mega projects that should be their own environmental impact statement. Well, the current administration has rolled all of them into one and then fast tracked it. So they shortened public comment period. They've designed their studies about bears. So this is a new component, and they said, well, we really only need to study bears 3 miles from the affected areas. So as someone who knows the area, when I read their aerial surveys and you read through and say, oh, we didn't see many bears, I know that if they'd flown over just one more hill, they would have seen McNeil Falls. They have intentionally excluded the most bears. Like they've crafted it in such a way that they don't have to do their due diligence. And it will have huge impacts on the bear viewing industry. We've commissioned for 20 years, this fight's been revolved around the sockeye fishery in Bristol Bay, which is the last intact sockeye salmon fishery in the world. 60 plus million fish a year come back. It supports $1.5 billion a year, or it brings in $1.5 billion a year, 14,000 jobs. And you want to put a copper mine, not just a copper mine, the biggest copper mine in the world, right at the headwaters of the Bristol Bay fishery. Bristol Bay shouldn't be unique. Bristol Bay, that type of fishery used to, everywhere from the Sacramento River all the way up, used to have stuff like this. And what makes it unique is it's the last. And, you know, what's lost in this too, I think, is the scale. You know, people say, oh, it's just another mine in Alaska. This is the largest copper mine in the world, where if you took all the mines in Alaska and you put them all in one place, this mine would be 8 times larger. And it's in a remote area. And so there are power issues, there are water issues. It will turn the Alaska Peninsula and all this pristine wilderness and sockeye fishery runs and natural bear habitat and all that, it's going to turn it into a mining district. And it's a sulfide mine. So just the act of digging a hole introduces things to the air that creates sulfuric acid. And so you're going to have to maintain this forever. Like this is the Superfund site in waiting. Like we will be paying for this for years and years and years, well beyond our time. Like this is a forever. There's no going back from this. Mm-hmm. And you've already got this that produces billions of dollars. And if you just leave it alone, just leave it alone. It's just that easy.
Well, and it's the battle's been won so many times, and it just keeps coming back, right? It just won't stop. And isn't it a Canadian company even who's the group that owns this?
It is a Canadian company, Northern Dynasty Minerals out of Vancouver. And really, most of the big mining companies aren't American anymore. Like, and this company they're small. They're a prospecting company. They go in and they find deposits, and then they bring in larger partners. And if you look at the history of this project, some of the biggest mining companies in the world have come and gone through this. Like Rio Tinto, for example, huge mining company. When they backed out of the project, they released a statement saying it's too risky. They didn't categorize that risk, whether it was environmental risk or business risk. Plus, it's a remote area. To get your money back out of it, it just doesn't pencil out. Like there are technologies in their statement. They say, oh, we're going to do this. But we'll invent that technology. We don't want to be a guinea pig here. Like we don't even want to talk about it.
Right. Don't even want it to get that far. Tell me, isn't there another project too that's near Lake Clark that is a mine?
Yes.
And are they married in any way, or are these two completely separate projects?
It is this one kind of interconnected, crappy political mess. So let's see. There's the Johnson Tract in Lake Clark National Park, and It goes back to before Lake Clark was a national park. So it goes back to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, which is where we've definitely taken a turn. We're no longer talking about cameras.
That's fine. I think it's important
history
to talk about this stuff, and people need to know.
So when they were building the pipeline, there was a deal that went all the way up to Congress, and it was the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. So in exchange for roughly $1 billion and roughly 9% of the total area of the state of Alaska, which the natives could pick, they created native corporations. So we don't have traditional reservations like you'd have in the lower 48. There's one or two, but most of them are native lands owned by native corporations that are divided up regionally, and then there's another one for unlanded natives. But so when they were picking the land, one of the native corporations picked the Johnson Tract specifically for its mineral riches, right? And then after that, Lake Clark National Park popped up around it. So you've got this inholding in the park that is basically mineral rich, and it was it was being pushed like they wanted to. The current administration is friendly to projects like this, and it would require a road, it would require all this infrastructure, and it would basically disrupt goings on in the park. It has kind of fallen to a lower priority because the guy that was pushing it has now been installed as the commissioner of the Department of Environmental Conservation in Alaska, which is now being headed by a mining guy, basically. Like it's corruption all the way to the top.
Is that at the state level or is that at the federal level?
At the state. That's at the state level. But at the federal level, so under the previous administration, the EPA, at the request of local tribes in the area, did an analysis of the Pebble mine and said, no, it cannot coexist safely with the fishery that's there, that already generates billions of dollars. And so when the administrations changed and Scott Pruitt was installed in his high-level position, there was a meeting between the Pebble folks and him, and basically said, not only is it back on, it's fast track, and we're going to try and ram this thing through in the next 4 years, come hell or high water. And so we're going to disregard science. We're going to disregard the voice of the people. I've said, I don't know how many hours of public testimony I've sat through, but it shakes down to about 80% of Alaskans are opposed to this project. And we're Alaskans. We're not opposed to development. We get our money from the oil industry. Like we are not opposed to. I listen to these public comments, and you get up and you talk. You got your 3 minutes, and then the guy after you gets up there, and he's a crusty Alaskan dude. He gets up there in his bunny boots and his coveralls and his dirty hat, and he says, I've been an Alaskan for 40 years, or, fill in the high number there. And he says, I'm not opposed to development, but I am opposed to this project, and here's why. And it's usually revolving around fisheries. It's usually Alaskan identity, native cultures. Like this is a direct threat to the Alaskan way of life. And we've got other mines that are, smaller and less of a footprint. But the scale of this project is unprecedented in human history. And the fact that it would go in under my watch is not something I'm comfortable with. And so I've really tried to back away from guiding. Like I can't do those long boat trips anymore. I need to have email and things like that. And I'm trying to position myself as more the sharp, pointy end of the conservation stick right now. And I'm going to be I've got my nonprofit Friends of McNeil River, and we're partnered with World Wildlife Fund and National Parks Conservation Association and Cook Inlet Keeper, and the list goes on and on and on. And we're going to Washington, D.C. at the beginning of next month. We've already got meetings set up with Lisa Murkowski and Dan Sullivan, the senators from Alaska already, and also looking to meet up with folks like Lindsey Graham and some of the power players in the Senate. It's going to be my job to go in and point out from a bear perspective, because we're a relatively small cog in this wheel. But, if you look at the bear viewing industry in South Central Alaska, we generate about 500 jobs. We generate about $40 million a year, and about 79% of that $40 million stays in South Central Alaska. This is Alaskans making money for Alaskans. This is the stuff that gets spent on groceries. This is the stuff that gets spent on home improvements. These are the dollars that keep multiplying through our economy. And if you look at Homer, for example, I don't mean to brag, but we are the halibut capital of the world. It says it right on the sign. Self-proclaimed halibut capital of the world. If you look at the visitor's guide from 1980, it's got a giant halibut on it. If you look at the visitor's guide to Homer now, it's got a bear on the front. Like, our tourist economy has diversified to the point that bear viewing is a major economic player. And if we want that to continue, we need to fight this horrible, horrible project that has no financial merits. It's got no science background, and it's being forced on us from above. This is the first time. I've always been somebody that just, I'd be happy. You put me on a river, I'll go fishing, I'll go watch bears, whatever. But now I feel that there's a direct threat to the places I love, and two, to my livelihood. And it's really been, I'm more active on Instagram than any other social media, but the support we've gotten is pretty remarkable. People from all walks of life. I was just chatting with, there's a kid on Instagram, Tony Morrison. He takes some great photos. But I got an email from him, or a message on Instagram saying, "Hey, I just contacted my legislators and told them all about Pebble Mine." Like, heck yeah. Like, that's what it takes. The more people that realize that this is a threat. And then, I mean, I don't have to tell you guys, but a picture says 1,000 words. Like, the photos that people get on the Alaska Peninsula of bears, things like that, like, those are the testament. Those are the things that are going to win this fight. And that's the role of photographers in conservation, is spreading the word. You don't have to give away your secret spots, but paint that broad picture that this place is worth saving. So to all the listeners, if watching bears on the Alaska Peninsula is on your bucket list, and may you never reach the end of your bucket list, may it just go endlessly. But if that's a priority for you, you can't just sit back, and you need to fight to save this.
Yeah. Wyoming is a lot like Alaska in that that's where people make their livelihood, right? The vast majority of people in my part of the state are involved in natural resource development, either oil, coal, but it's responsible natural resources development. There are studies done. There are exceptions to where they can and can't work. Let's just, for instance, paint this into the lower 48 picture and say that, the Grand Teton held the biggest copper deposit in the lower 48. Would we allow someone to come in and develop a mine in Grand Teton National Park? And I think when, people are more familiar with the Tetons, and I don't think anybody would stand for that. There are places in this country that just need to stay wild. And I think that, the McNeil River and that whole ecosystem on the peninsula is one of those places. I mean, this isn't the only, we talked to Garrett Vinn. He discussed another project with us a little bit further out toward the Aleutians. And there are just places that need to stay wild. And the ecotourism industry, I would think, would be an impetus for legislators to maintain that. And I hope that that's the case. And that's, I don't want to turn this into a downer issue of Wild and Exposed. We've had some fun talking about bears, but I do think people need to be educated. And I'm glad we got into this discussion for that reason, because I think people need to be educated as to what's going on and how it's happening, not just that it's happening.
So I agree 100% on all that. What do people need to know? What can people, so you said if somebody puts this on their bucket list and they never get to their bucket list, that's probably reality for a lot of people. But they still have a passion for just knowing that this wild exists, right? There's got to be something in everybody's psyche that has got to know that we can't just destroy everything on this planet, hopefully. What can people that may never ever touch foot, never ever see a brown bear out there, what can they do, or how do they educate themselves? And then what are those action steps? Is there something that's tangible? I mean, because I think a lot of people look at something like that and they're like, oh man, I'm just one person. I can't do any good. I'm not going to make a difference. And then nothing gets done, right? What's out there that we can put out there as a little roadmap or a little guide to say, if you just did this, this, and this, it would speak volumes to this audience?
Well, so thanks for asking. If you go to friendsofmcneilriver.org, and you click on the Pebble Mine navigational tab, there are a few things you can list on there. First off, kind of the fun thing you can do is I created a social media guide for people who want to become involved. Whether or not you have your own pictures of brown bears from the Alaska Peninsula, it's got a list of hashtags and places where you can look to find more imagery of the Alaska Peninsula and these bears specifically. It's also got on there, how do you contact the U.S. Senator from Alaska, Lisa Murkowski? And it's not just Lisa, because a lot of times, she, like if you're emailing her, she just takes emails from Alaskans. But this is still a federal issue because it's currently, up until the middle of summer, it's in the hands of the Army Corps of Engineers. And so you can currently write to your own legislators. You can write to, if you've got a House member that's on the Infrastructure and Transportation Committee, or just your senator in general, say, hey, this is something that is going through the Army Corps right now, and I don't like it. And even if they don't have a direct tie, like my goal is to put it on everybody's radar in the federal government. I want everybody in the federal government to know that something shady is going on and this is not going to stand. And so you can contact my legislature, you can contact your legislators on a federal level. And then there are certain organizations that you can sign up. You can either go to the defendbristolbay.org. And we'll have all this in the show notes for people. They don't need to frantically scribble this down. Defendbristolbay.org, and you can sign up for the mailing list, just because it's one of those things that, like right now, we're trying to stop the federal permit. Well, if they get the federal permit, then they've got to get 17 state permits. And so the things that I am going to ask people to do are going to change over time. If you'd asked me that question a year ago, I would have said comment to the Army Corps of Engineers. Now I say contact your legislature. Next week or next month, I'm going to say something different. And the system is set up like that to benefit Pebble. Like there is not just one thing you can do. And so you need to follow the organizations, follow me on Instagram, because I'm always, when there's something new, it's going to be on there. And I look at, we've got this kind of informal group of photographers on, and you know, the people that I have reached out to through this fight, like the guy that really knocked it out of the park with his blog post was Art Wolf. You know, I got all the talking points to him, and frankly, check out Art Wolf's blog post on this subject. And he tells you contact Lisa Murkowski. He gives you all the pertinence on everything. And because Art's out there every year, he goes to Alaska and you see him running around, walking around in the preserve.
Right.
This group of folks on Instagram that here when the Army Corps is going to release their environmental impact statement in hopefully June, a lot more. You go watch like Brad Joseph's video. He's big. He's a video guy. He's got all sorts of epic bear fights and stuff on there. And Dawn Wilson, you know, she's going to be posting stuff. And we're going to have Greg Piper, Fiona Nixon, just all these people with these fantastic bear photos are going to be ramping up a bear campaign. So pay attention to it. We'll be given instruction, whether it's contacts legislators, whether it's whatever needs to be, whatever the next step, it will be apparent via that Instagram channel or the friendsofmcneilriver.org.
And that's one of the reasons we wanted to kind of have you. It's kind of timely conversation. People will have a couple weeks when they hear your story, take some of those action steps that Mike was talking about. And we'll post links also on the show notes and some of the organizations that you were naming. So they're easily discovered on, just through a Google search, or like Drew said, you can find him on Instagram and maintain some updates. So we'll definitely do that. And we hope that people will take some of those actions and let some people know, that we do need wild spaces.
It blows my mind because there's just so many organizations. We started doing a podcast 11 years ago, if you can believe it. We started way before podcasting was cool, but it was a fish podcast. I had a friend that was totally into fishing, and I got another buddy, and we were talking about the Pebble Mine way back then. And so you got these fishing organizations, you've got hunting, you've got outdoor recreational. I mean, it's so big. And I think everybody would have, well, I'm obviously biased, but there just got to be way more people against a project like this than for it. And it's just getting that word out and having the masses tell people this is not cool.
Well, that's one of the challenges we've been facing with the bear aspect of it, because if you're a bear person, if you're a photographer that wants to photograph bears, or just take solace in the fact that these wild places exist, this is a new aspect of it. For 20 years it was fish because the mind was all this theoretical what if, and now that they've actually released their plan, air quotes for the folks listening in their cars, because the threat to McNeil River and the bears of the Alaska Peninsula didn't become apparent till 2 years ago. And so when the Pebble fight that's been going on for so long, when it reared its ugly head again, the folks that have been fighting for so long, they just put their heads down, put their extra tufts back on, and got back in the trenches using the same talking points. And so when this bear aspect came out, the first two people I called were Dave Applin at World Wildlife Fund and Ben Bressler at Natural Habitat Adventures, that they operate bear tours along that coast. And I've done a lot of fun stuff with them. And to their credit, they both said, what do we need to do? And the first thing, like, Ben chartered a plane so that I could set up a camp at the port site and have a CNN crew come out there. Like, the people that have come out and just said, nope, we're not going to, nope, the line has been crossed. And then World Wildlife Fund, I couldn't do this fight without World Wildlife Fund. They're a flashy international organization, but everybody that has their boots on the ground that I've ever met with them is just top notch. And so at that meeting, I said, well, look, I don't need to tell World Wildlife Fund that you need a bear as your spokesperson. Here, we got them right here. Let's do this. So they've just been, the people that have risen to the occasion on this have just been so fantastic. It really, it warms your heart. And there are times when you feel, because I've just been down in Mexico trying to email lawyers and stuff like that. Oh, and I'm suing the federal government. Put that on my list of stuff I never thought I'd do. Yeah, we're currently involved in a lawsuit against the EPA. I'm just a guy who likes watching bears. Suddenly I'm emailing lawyers from hotel rooms in Mexico, and it's just been really complicated to try and keep track of all the moving pieces on this.
So you said your book that you're doing with Don, part of the proceeds are going to go to this organization, your organization. Can people just donate directly?
You can.
Okay.
Through the website, you go there and you click on the button that says donate. And that's fantastic. Every dime right now is getting spent on Pebble fights. And but it's also sign up for the email list, because that's where you get important information, and that's what keeps you the most up to date. Also, we've got a film that's going to be touring with the Wild and Scenic Film Festival, which is the largest traveling wilderness film festival. So if you see it come into a theater near you, be sure and go check it out and make sure they're playing a Mactadori Redux. It's French. I don't know. I don't speak French.
When you have a natural area that is so pristine, can't we just have that? Can't we just... Everybody protects their own little livelihood, right? And it can be misconstrued that, well, you're a photographer, you just want to photograph these bears for your own little personal enjoyment. that's true for sure. But if I didn't ever photograph a bear for the rest of my life, and I just knew that there was a place that bears could be bears and do their thing and not be interrupted, is worth more to me than anything else.
Mhm.
And your choice of words there is very telling. The guy that Clem Tillian, who was an Alaska State Legislature in the 60s, 1967, when McNeil River was established, he's still around. He's in his 90s. He loves telling stories. You go over to Halibut Cove and he'll talk your ear off about everything, anything. But his quote was, I just like the idea that there's a place where bears can be bears.
Yep.
And so he created McNeil River. We should talk about something fun to close with. We kind of took this downer.
It's not a downer though.
It's good education.
We got to get the word out. Before we go, you wrote an article for our web page on the stitching of, and I've had it up there since you wrote it.
Oh, really?
I just didn't. We wanted to get 3 or 4 or 5 in the queue so that we didn't put one out and then it just dies off. But since we're having you on the podcast, this is the perfect time to put it out there. Maybe you could just give a little heads up as to what's in that article and why people want to go check it out. Now, we have all your images. We have everything you wrote is there. So it's going to be awesome as far as once they get there. But just give them a little idea of, because you mentioned it earlier, we briefly touched on it, but just give a little elevator speech on what they can find.
So, and I mentioned earlier, a lot of this stems from my shooting style and the fact that I only carry one lens at a time. And a lot of times it's that fixed lens. And since we're not, like when we go out and I'm the guide, I'm not necessarily setting up for my focal length. I'm setting up for what the group needs. Right. And so that puts me at this 600 millimeter equivalent, oftentimes too close for the subject if I wanted a little habitat or things like that. I think the incident I described was when you had the ultimate situation where you've got polar bears crawling over a whale skull up on the Arctic coast, and you realize you're too close. And so one of the things that I really like about this Olympus system I have is that it's ridiculously fast. And in its fastest shooting rate, I can just basically hold the button, it locks the exposure, it locks the focus, and then just pan with it. You can pan up, you can pan down, and then in Photoshop or Lightroom, you stitch them together, and you'll actually get, like, I can stitch bears walking. It's easier when they're sitting, but you can stitch moving animals and things like that. And it's really, like, if you find yourself, it's a workaround. This is our pro tip, I guess, of the day.
Yeah.
There you go.
It's a workaround if you find yourself with the wrong lens and you're just not quite set up around. And if you think about it and it happens just like that, you can be ready. And it also helps. It has helped me lighten my kit in that I don't have to carry, or I don't have to fumble around with that second body. I don't have to switch lenses. If it's just a situation that I need to adapt to quickly and get that panorama, or even just stitching 2 shots. You know, take a picture of the animal and the habitat next to it with a locked focus and exposure, and then you can create an image that has the subject, it's got the habitat. I find it makes me more versatile and expands the range of my, plus you get all this resolution, so you can blow these images up to the sides of a bus if you got a bus that you're trying to put a bear on the side
that you want to wrap. No, I think you end up with a much more compelling image. I mean, you look at your article, and when people go and read this article and look at the pictures, I think that, it's just something about stitching those images. You would never get that in the camera. Or if you did, it would be so wide. I don't know. I think it's just the compression plays into it. It's much different than if you shot that with a 50 or an 80. If you're shooting it with a 300 and you're stitching it, I think you just get a whole different image.
It kind of gives it, I think it kind of gives it a medium format feel.
Yes.
Yeah. And and whatever a medium format feel is, I leave that to you guys to
I know what you're saying,
but it's different. It is different. So there's my pro tip. What are your pro tips?
Oh man, I didn't come prepared.
Yeah, we figured we'd have plenty to talk about with you.
Okay.
Yeah, We'll get on the next one. I'll have one ready. We'll do a pro tip in the field with bears out in front of us when we do that podcast in July. That'll be awesome. Because there's so many little things that you got to know when you're out there that you need to have or need to pay attention to. We can have a blast doing that. Maybe we could even get 2 podcasts while we're out there.
There we go.
One on the getting rid of the pebble mine and the other one just on bear photography.
There we go. Make sure the eyes are in focus.
Yeah, that's important.
Little...
Drew, before we let you go, can you give us your Instagram handle and then some of the other places people can find you on the internet?
Yeah. Drew HH on Instagram, drewhh.com on the World Wide Web. And then my nonprofit is Friends of McNeil River, and that's friendsofmcneilriver.org. And actually just Googling Drew Hamilton, Alaska brown bear pops up a bunch of the videos and the viral video we were talking about before. Everybody should watch it a bunch of times so I get a nickel.
One last thing that we should throw in there too, if people wanted to go on a bear viewing trip with you, how do they do that?
For bear viewing, for brown bear viewing, it is goseebears.com, AK Adventures. You'll get it's my partner Dave Backrack and I our AK Adventures. For polar bear adventures, it's discoverchurchill.com. And so you'll get to talk to my buddy Alex DeVries in Churchill, and he's probably freezing his butt off watching Aurora right now. So he'll get back to you when he thaws out. And then the Monarch Butterflies is at nathab.com. Well, thank you so much for having me, guys, today. This is
thank you.
I listen to you guys all the time, and it's just like sitting around with my buds, talking cameras, talking bears. It's really, really been a good time.
Yeah, it's always fun to dig into somebody else's world for a while. It takes me away from mine, which is at the moment not very exciting.
Well, come up to Alaska, catch some winter.
Yeah,
always soon.
Gonna do it. Thanks, Drew.
All right, talk to you guys later.
You've been listening to the Wild and Exposed podcast. Thanks for tuning in.
We got our windows down, driving down the 405, sing along to the radio. We're gonna make it someday, nothing's gonna get in our way. We will be the biggest band in town.